Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our relevant series event for tonight, Why Am I Here? A Christian and Atheist Dialogue. My name is Carol, and I'm going to be your MC for tonight. So before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping announcements. Please keep your phones, tablets, smartwatches, anything else that would make noise on silent for the duration of the talk. For the location of the washrooms, what you'll have to do is exit the doors, go down the stairs, turn left, keep walking through the bicycle racks, turn right. There should be signs for the male and female washrooms there. We are also going to have a Q&A session with the audience after the dialogue portion. So if you have questions during the talk, feel free to just write them down or make note of them. And you could also text them to the number 647-466-0468 if you're afraid you're going to forget. We're also going to have that number on the screen when the Q&A with the audience starts. And I think that's about it. So now I'm just going to introduce our two guests with us tonight. So tonight we have the pleasure of hearing a dialogue between Professor Wayne Sumner and Abdu Murray. Wayne Sumner is a professor emeritus from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. He holds a PhD from Princeton University and is the author of numerous books in the fields of ethics, philosophy of law, and political philosophy, including The Moral Foundation of Rights and Welfare, Happiness, and Ethics. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and in 2009 was awarded the Molson Prize by the Canada Council for the Arts. We also have joining us Abdu Murray, who is the North American Director of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and is the author of several books such as Saving Truth, Finding Meaning and Clarity in a Post-Truth World. For most of his life, Abdu was a proud Muslim who studied the Quran and Islam. After a 9-year investigation into the major world religions and worldviews, he discovered that the Christian faith can answer the questions of the mind and the longings of the heart. Abdu has spoken to diverse audiences across the globe. He also holds a BA in psychology from the University of Michigan, as well as his Juris Doctor from the University of Michigan Law School. As an attorney, Abdu was named several times in Best Lawyers of America, and he currently lives in Detroit with his family. So please give a warm welcome to our speakers, and I'd also like to invite Steve Hugo, our moderator for tonight.
Okay, where do you want us?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone here for coming out tonight, and especially to our speakers. I think we're in for a treat. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And so a little bit about the format tonight. We're just going to have more of a coffee-style dialogue. We're just at Starbucks talking.
Where's the coffee?
We can probably get some coffee if we really want some. We're just going to discuss the meaning of life, why are we here, and we're going to delve into a number of different issues. So we've given the speakers a few questions to kind of percolate in their minds beforehand, and we'll just launch into a couple different themes this evening, and we'll see where the conversation goes, and at the end you'll have an opportunity to ask your own questions. And so why don't we just start off with some softies, and so, Professor Sumner, you've talked a lot about kind of morality and kind of what the responsibilities of individuals are. So the first topic that I really want to kind of explore with both of you is freedom, autonomy. What does it mean that we're free? Or are we determined to some degree? And what are kind of those limits, and what role does society have in shaping and forming those freedoms? And so I guess on the surface, if you were to answer the question, are we determined or are we free, how would you answer that? And I'll give it to Professor Sumner to start us off.
Okay, well, the first thing a philosopher does when asked a question is to start drawing distinctions. Freedom's a big umbrella term, and it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. In your preamble, you mentioned the relationship between the individual and society, and that raises questions of freedom, individual liberty, and so on. But you seem to want to focus on a different kind of issue about freedom, where the opposite of freedom is something like determinism, and the issue is whether we have free will or something like that. Is that what you want to explore?
I want to do
a bit?
both. I want to do
You want to do both?
Yeah.
Well, where do you want to start?
Let's start with let's start at the kind of the root philosophical stuff about determinism and free will, and then we'll
Okay.
move into the social side of it.
Okay. So I've been a philosopher for a long time, taught philosophy at U of T for decades. As a philosopher, you've got a sort of vast field in front of you, various issues in philosophy and so on. You figure out after a while which ones you're really interested in, and you work on those. For me, those were largely issues in ethics, normative issues in ethics. One of the issues that never interested me at all was the debate between free will and determinism. I could never see what was at stake in that, and never took sides with it, and never sort of saw it as really a real issue. So if you ask, are we free or are we determined? My only answer is, well, we're both. We're determined because everything in nature is causally determined, and we're in nature, and we can't stand outside those causal processes. So everything about us is causally determined, just as everything about anything else in nature is causally determined. But I don't think that impugns or impinges on our freedom in any way at all. Our freedom is a matter of our ability to direct our own futures. I think there's often a confusion in people's minds between determinism on the one hand and fatalism on the other. And fatalism is a view that it doesn't matter what you decide or what you choose to do, you're going to end up in the same place. But determinism doesn't tell you that at all. Determinism, if anything, says, look, your decisions are part of the causal process as well. They causally determine what happens in the world. Without your interventions, without your decisions, without your choices, things will go differently. You've got an open future. You determine how things go in that future. And the fact that your decisions may themselves be the product of causal forces, I don't think makes any difference at all. So I have no problem with the free will debate, trying to reconcile free will and determinism. I think they're both true.
Okay. How about you, Abdu?
I think it's sort of a similar position. By the way, the fact that so many causal factors almost didn't let me be here, my plane being canceled and all these other things happening, but somehow things lined up so that I could actually be here for a topic of why am I here, which is hysterical to me. Actually makes me think about, I'm just glad that I am here. Let's let it be there. But it sort of has something that I agree with in one sense, is that there is a sense in which things are determined in a certain way. There are causal factors. For example, if I set up a system of dominoes and I knock one over, it's likely because of the laws of physics that the next one's going to get knocked over if they're placed properly. And if without those causal factors, we couldn't do things like science. We couldn't predict how things are going to act. We couldn't make reasonable observations and then draw conclusions from that. It's much like I think of the analogy of playing billiards, where you have a table with boundaries and bumpers beyond which you can't play outside of, but you can do a whole lot of things inside of it as well. And so you can think of it that way. However, I do think that this debate actually has some import beyond just simply the academic. I think that, for example, we take people like Sam Harris, for example, who wrote a book called Free Will, where he argues there is none, or Jerry Coyne, and other, whether they're biologists or they're physiologists or they're neurologists or just philosophers, who would say that we are chemical machines, and if we are chemical machines and that's all we are, then all we do is respond to external stimuli. And so our decision making is actually just chemical reactions to external stimuli based on our chemical makeup. Now that's not not everybody believes that position, but some do. And so Sam Harris actually thinks, for example, that we don't actually, if we want to incarcerate people for wrong actions, there's no real wrong action so much as it's an unfortunate person who's reacting to their chemical makeup, and instead of incarcerating them, we ought to chemically treat them, and that'll sort of create some better behaviors or whatever it might be. Jerry Coyne was once quoted as saying essentially that all your decisions, you might think they're decisions, but all they are is a series of very complex, almost imperceptibly they can't really be different from what we think of as decisions because they're so complex, but they are decisions that are based on chemical reactions, and therefore the decision you made is the only one you could have made. But then you have other people, thinkers like Raymond Tallis, who's also an atheist, who says, no, there's something about us that's physical, obviously, but there's something more to us than that. In his book, Aping Mankind, he actually goes at great lengths to debunk the idea that we're just automata. But at the end, when he says, I've gone through 348 pages of telling you what's wrong with physicalism, and you say, okay, very well, Dr. Tallis, tell us what's right. And he says, I don't know, which is interesting all by itself. But I do think we're endowed, as a Christian, I think we're endowed with something that does transcend the physical, where we do have physical bodies that are part of the system, but we do have something that is endowed with a will that transcends that. That's what it means, I think, to be made in the image of God. So I think the question is an important one because it does go to the heart of what we actually are and what the thing that created us actually is as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with so much of that. You don't have to be a Christian to think that we're more than physical machines, right? It's common sense folk psychology that we have minds as well as bodies. And that our responses to the world are mediated through our mental processes as much as they are through physical processes. Christians and adherents of certain other religions have certain take on what that means. For me, it just means, we're part of the natural order, and minds are as much a part of the natural order as bodies are. But, you mentioned these views that try to reduce us to chemistry. That's why I find this debate uninteresting. Because to say that everything is causally determined, or to say that everything can be scientifically explained, isn't to say that everything can be reduced to chemistry or physics. That's an added step that reduces us just to chemical processes or to something much less than we are. And I don't see any reason to take that step. I'm perfectly happy with the idea that everything I do and everything about me is a product of causal forces. I don't find that a demeaning idea, a demeaning view of myself at all. But to reduce me to just chemistry, yeah, I find that demeaning. I don't, that's not my image of what I am or what I'm doing. But I don't think believing in determinism requires believing that it's a particular kind of purely physical process that drives everything we do. That's one of the reasons I find the debate not that interesting, because it lends itself to that kind of reductionism.
Yeah, I think that part of the debate, though, spawns interesting questions like, is the mind the brain? Are they exactly the same? In which case someone would lead to the idea, if they are the same, then it does, I think, inevitably reduce us to meat computers, as I heard one philosopher once say.
Interesting.
But you also wanted to raise questions about freedom in the other sense of relationship.
Sure, yeah. So in the social sphere, so maybe we'll start with Abdu this time.
Sure.
In your book, Saving Truth, which is down here and at the back, you talk a little bit about getting freedom wrong.
Yeah.
Why don't you expound on that a little bit and talk about kind of what you call the negative freedom and the positive freedom that exists in the world?
Sure. I think that we talk awful lot now, especially in Western society, about freedom. And our movies, the best movies are movies where someone wins their freedom, or they get eviscerated while screaming the word freedom, this kind of thing. And we have this sort of love affair with freedom. And it's good. Os Guinness once said that you can judge a health of a society by how it interacts with its chief virtues. And one of the chief virtues of Western society is the idea of individual and freedom. The problem is, I think, is that we've started to go down a road where we're not talking about freedom anymore because we're talking about only one side of the coin. And in fact, we actually think that freedom is a one-sided coin, which is nonsense in one sense. We think freedom is the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, whatever way you want. And that's not freedom. I think that that's autonomy. And autonomy's got many, many different strands, but a baseline of unfettered autonomy, it comes from two Greek words, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law. So when you're autonomous, essentially you're a law unto yourself, if you're strictly autonomous. And I think we're striving for that level of autonomy where we can be determiners of everything about what we are, who we are, and how we act and think. And that's certainly true to a degree, but we've only seen one facet of freedom, and that is the freedom from restriction. Isaiah Berlin actually points out very well, there are two facets to freedom. There's freedom from restriction, But there's also a positive freedom, the freedom for something, the freedom from restriction so that you have the freedom for something like excellence and the greater good and these kind of things. And I think that we've only seen freedom lately as a one-sided thing. Don't tread on my boundaries. I want to have no boundaries. I think that that's dangerous on a number of levels because, I mean, if you think about it, if that's the case and we just want our freedoms to do whatever we want, whatever way we want, then we start bumping into each other, and I think in undesirable and often, I think, messy ways. But if preferences matter more than truth, for example, and truth being a boundary of freedom, if preferences matter more than that, and my preferences have to be given full vent because I'm autonomous, and someone else is autonomous, and their preferences matter just as much, but my preferences collide with their preferences. If there's no boundaries, we're not going to have truth as an arbiter between us. We won't even have necessarily the value of another person as the arbiter between us. We're going to have power be the arbiter between us. And I think that leads, ironically, unfettered freedom leads, in one sense, to either chaos or authoritarianism.
So that's actually a perfect segue into what I was going to ask Professor Sumner. So you wrote an important Canadian book, The Hateful and the Obscene, which kind of deals with some of these issues of the limits of freedom, especially freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. How does that kind of play into this discussion? I found it quite an interesting read.
Yeah, my philosophical roots are in the British utilitarian tradition, including and maybe preeminently John Stuart Mill. And so I tend to come at issues of individual freedom and individual liberty from the point of view that Mill did, where it's very much a matter of attempting to secure space for individuality against the coercive and oppressive tendencies, not only of the state, but of majorities. So what Mill prized was individuality, which is a little different from both freedom and autonomy as Abdu was sketching those out. It's the opportunity for individuals to decide their life courses for themselves, to decide their lifestyles for themselves, to live according to their own set of values. It's rather closer to the idea of autonomy than it is to the idea of freedom, but it involves freedom and it requires freedom because it requires the freedom requires protection from the interference of others. It requires a lot more than that too. It requires not just the negative, which Abdu was adverting to, freedom from, but also a lot of positive facilitation. I mean, people can't live rich and meaningful lives for themselves just if they have negative freedom, just if they're free of the interference or oppression of others. They also have to be supported through educational processes and so on to develop their idea of themselves and to develop a means of living their own lives. You mentioned the free speech book. I was focusing there just on what I took to be one very important component of freedom within this space, this protected space, a space protected from social interference. And that's the ability to express yourself, to express your own opinions, to form your own beliefs, but also to have the space to express them freely without the interference of others, without being shut down by others who disagree with you. And this has become rather a relevant topic these days, especially on campuses, right? Where this kind of freedom, both the freedom to speak and all, but equally importantly, the freedom to hear, right? These can sometimes seem to be under assault. And it was that kind of suppression of speech by if not majorities, at least hostile others, that Mill was particularly concerned about and why he was so passionate in his defense of individual liberty. And I tried to be passionate in that book also in my defense of individual liberty of expression, but recognizing that there are legitimate limits, and the focus of the book was trying to carve out where those limits might be.
Great. Do you, either you want to respond to anything you've heard from the other speakers so far?
No, I think that in large measure there's some nuance to be gleaned from both, I think, both sketches of how I think freedom actually works. There has to be this sense of, I think, freedom to be fully enjoyed and to be fully expressed, not just simply in the strict philosophical sense of do what you want. I think that there has to be that element of do what you want in accordance with what you should. And I think one other thing that I would add to it is the Christian view of freedom, for example, isn't just simply do what you want. It's not even do what you want in accordance with what you should. The Christian view of freedom is do what you want in accordance with what you should based on what you are. And what you are, in the Christian perspective, is a being made in God's image. Now, the realization of that, I think, actually subjects us, in one sense, to a sort of an understanding that we're not just the mere meat computers that react to things outside of ourselves without actual thought, without actual morality, or an inherentness that's sort of inherently dignified, as opposed to different than other animals, for example, that just sort of either whose only boundaries really are their own instincts. We can transcend those instincts because we have that endowment of being made in the image of God. So I would say that that's one other aspect of freedom I didn't mention earlier, but I think that idea of you can do what you want based on what you should in accordance with what you are.
Can I just?
Yeah, for sure.
See, there was a hint of that in what Abdu said in his first remarks, and now it's becoming a little bit more overt, and this is the part that scares me, because this seems to imply that freedom requires that you do the right thing. You're not being really free if you aren't doing what you should. But I think that's a very dangerous idea. Within the realm of speech rights, which again are the ones that interest me the most, it would seem to imply that you're only free to express your beliefs if they're the right beliefs. And freedom of speech doesn't mean anything if you're only free to speak the truth or only free to say the right thing. You have to be free to say terrible things, things you shouldn't say. So I don't think there's this relationship between freedom and the right, freedom and what you should do, freedom and what is the right thing to do, that Abdu seems to be taking for granted. He mentioned Isaiah Berlin before and the distinction between negative and positive freedom. Berlin was very suspicious of positive freedom because he thought it led in that direction. You're only free if you're free to develop yourself in the right way. And that leads to the pernicious idea that you can be forced to be free. And that's a road down which I don't want to go. So I think freedom is neutral as to whether what you're doing is a good thing or a bad thing. The limits of freedom are where you impinge upon others' freedom. That's where the limits lie.
Well, and I would just, just for clarity's sake, is that I would agree with what you said, is that governmentally speaking or societally speaking, when you talk about imposing this is what's right, and who says it? Well, I happen to have the microphone, or I happen to have the most guns. So I say this is right, and therefore you can't act outside of the boundaries that I determined, or we as a collective have determined is what you should do. What I was talking about more is in terms of the perspective of an internal thing, where there is freedoms. You have the freedom in this country and in the US and in other, I think, countries where, I can't say that's true in every country, obviously, where you have the freedom to do the wrong thing, or to say something offensive or mean-spirited or whatever it might be. And I would actually champion those freedoms oftentimes because, as has been the case, everybody who has spoken at some point, at some time, has been unpopular in what they've said. And I certainly don't want to be on the sharp end of the stick of enforced what you should do. I think that the slippery slope can be avoided if we understand that sort of the meaning what I was talking about is based on ontology of what a human being actually is, which leads me to the idea that if some of the boundaries of freedom are when they bump up against other people, well, I think that's true, but it's not just convenience. It's not just a social contract where I don't bump into you because I don't want you bumping into me. I think it has more to do with seeing something in the other person. And I think that is a good way to express positive freedom as opposed to just simply a blanket way to express it, saying that the majority imposes it upon me. But your point is well taken. It can lead to something, if not taken seriously enough, it can lead to very monstrous things. That's why, again, quote Os Guinness, he said the only restraint that allows freedom to truly flourish is self-restraint.
So we're going to circle back on morality for sure. It's part of our evening. But before we do, the other branch of this idea of freedom is, like we talked a little bit about causing harm to others. So I want to talk a little bit about suffering. So there's suffering obviously caused by others, but also we live in a world that there seems to be unexplained suffering. Professor Sumner, why don't we start a little bit with you, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your work with euthanasia and how suffering and autonomy kind of work together in your kind of conclusion on this issue.
Whoa, okay. Now we're going down a different road. So
we're going to go down lots of roads tonight.
Looks like it. Looks like it. Okay, maybe I should explain a little bit about what I've been doing on that front. I've been an advocate for quite a long time in favor of physician-assisted dying. Both the ethics of it, that is defending the view that physician-assisted dying under appropriate circumstances can be ethical, and also advocating for legalization of it, which of course has happened in this country. And now we've had a few thousand people since June of 2016 who have availed themselves of that particular medical service. I wrote a couple of books on this, and in defending these views, I relied entirely on two values that I thought were at the core of them. One was suffering, and the other was autonomy. On the suffering side, my starting point was the idea that it's bad for individuals to suffer, that suffering has a claim on us, a claim when we can to do something about it, to prevent it or to alleviate it or stop it or whatever we can do. And that claim can take a number of different forms, but in some circumstances, carefully circumscribed circumstances, the claim can be to respond affirmatively to someone's request that they hasten their own death, or that their own death be hastened. So that's part of the case for the ethics of physician-assisted dying in circumstances in which it is the only or the most effective means of preventing an individual from continuing to suffer needlessly at the end of life. The other argument was from autonomy, and that one, the basic idea there is also very familiar. It's an issue of choice, just as so many other issues. The abortion issue is essentially an issue of choice as well, women's choice to have abortions. This is a case of respecting individuals' choices over how they will die, the circumstances of their death, when they will die, and so on, to allow individuals to determine the end of their lives in the same way in which they've been able to determine the rest of the course of their lives. And so the practice that I've been defending is of voluntary requests for physician-assisted dying, affirmative responses to which both respect the autonomy of the individual who's making the request, but also respond to the suffering which that individual is attempting to put an end to. So part of the picture there is that suffering matters. I think you can't really construct an adequate defense of not only physician-assisted dying, but palliative care, most of medicine, without presupposing that suffering is a bad thing and it's a good thing to try to respond to it. And we're going to be talking about morality at some point as well, I think. It seemed to be on the agenda. And I would say there that it's one of the starting points for moral or ethical thinking. You start with ground floor truths that seem self-evident. And for me, one of those truths is that individual personal suffering is an intrinsic evil and something that we need to, that's appropriate to, it's necessary to respond to.
Thanks. So Christianity has a weird relationship with suffering as a religion. Abdu, why don't you talk a little bit about suffering within that context?
Sure, I guess there's the theological and of course there's historical stuff. I mean, when you look at the history of humanity, when people get a hold of something, at some point they're going to make it serve themselves, no matter what the founder actually says. To that degree, you're going to have some of that, and I think I'm not sure that's what you're getting at in terms of like, when you look at the various things that the church has done. There are definitely pockmarks on the history of it, but there's the pockmarks on the history of everyone who's espoused a certain worldview and said, I'm doing this for these reasons, which of course isn't a reason to actually disabuse of that worldview or say that worldview isn't true. It's just the reality of it. I think specifically though, I think in theological terms, or when it comes down to what does the Christian worldview have to say about the significance of suffering in the human experience, whether it's because other people imposed it upon you, or did something that caused suffering, or whatever it might be, natural circumstances, whatever it might be, there's a couple of things here. The first thing is that suffering is bad in and of itself. Not every single instance of suffering only produces things that are bad. Sometimes it can lead to things that are good, despite the fact that it's got something bad to it. But suffering is not the way it was intended. It was not intended to be this way. And therefore, something can be and should be done about it. But it's interesting when we exercise our autonomy as human beings who can think and ask why questions. Macaques don't sit around asking why questions. They don't think to themselves, boy, I wonder why the bananas are so hard to get today. They don't do that. They don't think of these why questions, but we do. As a species, we do. And I think that that's interesting when it comes to the suffering question. When someone experiences something tragic, let's say a loved one dies, or they're getting bad news, maybe it's something really terrible in terms of their medical condition, one of the first things they ask is, why? One of the first things they ask is why. I find this terribly interesting because what they don't do when they win the lotto, or when they get a good grade, or when something just happens, like my flights happen to work out so I can be here, is ask, why? No one does that. We ask why questions for some reason, more often, though sometimes we do ask why when we get good stuff, for some reason, because of suffering. It somehow spurs us to ask, I think, deep, foundational questions about purpose, about meaning, about the morality of all of it. Somehow it forces us into these questions. I think that's interesting, that suffering can be a teacher in this way, or at least cause the impetus for us to actually ask why questions. And that leads me to, I think, one of the important things about the why. In some sense, I don't pretend to know why a particular instance of suffering has occurred, or why would God allow it, or whatever it might be. I think that that's presumptuous on anybody's part to say, I know why this happened. However, there is to say that with Christianity, for example, you have numerous ideas, the problem of suffering, the problem of evil. How can there be a good God if there's suffering and evil in the world? And for the most part, most philosophers have said that there's no inherent contradiction, because you can discuss this and say there's no inherent contradiction with a God existing and suffering existing. It's more of a probabilistic thing now. But one of the responses I think that's often given, and I think it bears there's many, but there's one that I think bears some scrutiny on the suffering issue because of the why question, is it could be that if God knows everything, if there's a being who knows literally everything, all things past, all things future, both actual and counterfactual, things that would have happened had you chose different, that it's plausible. It's at least possible, and I think even plausible, that he would allow, not cause, but allow some kind of suffering for a greater possible good in the future. Now, are we in a position to know that? Well, no, because we don't know all things, and therefore we can't say that those things can't possibly be true or happen. And that's where I think the Christian faith actually enters in to give significance to suffering. Your why question actually is significant. It's not simply a matter of instinct. It's not simply a matter of, I ask because I just ask. It's actually got something to it. And I think God respects that in the Christian faith, because it isn't just an aloof God who says, you guys are suffering down there. It's not a deistic idea. You're suffering down there, and I kind of don't care. Or I care, but my hands are tied. That's not what happens. In the Christian faith, God himself, who is the ground of all being in Christianity, actually understands what it means to suffer, because he sends his own son to die a horrible death, an ignominious death, on a cross so that we could have salvation. And so he identifies with that suffering. In other words, there are some strands of worldviews, pantheistic worldviews, that might say suffering is an illusion. Whether you're a Buddhist, sometimes Hindus say this as well. Suffering is an illusion, and you have to wake up from the illusion of that you're not divine and all these things, and you'll eventually be free of that suffering. Christianity says, no, it's not an illusion. It's actually so real that the ground of all reality, which is God, actually experiences it himself, so that one day you don't have to. And that's what salvation's all about. So there is this unique relationship, I think, where suffering is taken very, very seriously in the Christian faith. So the why questions actually make sense.
So what do you think about that?
I'm the atheist here, right? So I should say something about being an atheist, right? I mean, Abdu gets to talk about being a Christian, so I'll talk about being an atheist. So why am I? Well, there are a number of reasons. One of them is just the phenomenal lack of evidence for any kind of supernatural beings. And I like my beliefs to be evidence-based, and I go with the evidence, and I think that going with the evidence just doesn't support belief in any kind of deity whatsoever, whether Christian or otherwise. But that's, that's by the by. The other thing that motivates me, is the issue that Abdu adverted to, namely, how can the existence of anything like the Christian conception of God as omnipotent and omniscient be squared with the kinds of evils and the kinds of suffering that we see in the world around us? And I've just never been able to find any kind of adequate theodicy that's capable of reconciling those ideas. Sometimes I'm willing to accept parts of the explanation. I agree with Abdu that while I think suffering is an intrinsic evil, it doesn't mean it's always an instrumental evil. It can, some kinds of suffering can actually lead to good things. And so a benevolent God might think, well, the good things that it's leading to are greater than the suffering is, or better than the suffering is evil, and so on balance, things are working out well. But I just can't see how that can apply to so much of the suffering, so much of the self-evidently undeserved suffering that one finds. So I just can't square the existence of a God of anything like that nature with young children contracting, suffering, and dying of horrible diseases, horrible cancers. I mean, who would create a world in which things like that happen? And the idea that, all right, maybe there's some grand scheme that we don't understand that's part of, and it works out for the best. Okay, I'm going to use stronger. I find that repugnant. I find that idea repugnant. And I don't see why anyone would believe it.
Okay, I want to come back to that, and I'll let you guys engage that at the very end. But I want to kind of delve a little bit into morality, and then we can kind of come to these bigger questions. So I spent most of the weekend reading this book, Welfare, Happiness, and Ethics.
Oh, you poor guy. Sorry.
I really like this book a lot. It was a fantastic read. I recommend it. Do you still agree with it? It's 20 years old.
I haven't changed my mind about that. No.
Okay.
So, luckily.
So there's a lot of interesting ideas in this book, and I was wondering if you could kind of lead off the conversation on morality to talk about, one, your idea of welfarism, and then, and maybe, touch a little bit on this idea of pleasure and contrast that with well-being, and then a little bit about objective and subjective, and then we'll let Abdu come back in to the objective side of morality on the tail end of that conversation.
Okay, I don't know how much of that I can cover succinctly without boring the socks off the audience here. So when we were talking about suffering, I said, well, we'll be talking about morality, and when you start doing ethics and you start thinking about issues around right and wrong and so on, you want to start with some ground floor that you think is absolutely certain, something that approaches self-evidence. And I said at that point that the badness or intrinsic evil of suffering is part of that ground floor for me. But that's just one aspect of, and it's the negative aspect of, a broader category, which is well-being. And well-being is just the abstract idea of a life going well for the person who's living it. Suffering makes a life go badly, but lives can go well as well, luckily. I took happiness in the book to be the best explication of what it is for a life to go well. So happiness is the positive, for which suffering is the negative. And then, leaving all of the details aside, I thought this provides a secure ground floor for doing ethics. So the basic idea behind our ethical responsibilities or behind ideas of right and wrong is that we should try to make lives go well and prevent them from going badly. And I don't limit that, by the way, to human lives. I think that applies to any lives, the lives of any creatures which can go well or badly. That's our fundamental ethical responsibility. I said before that I come out of the utilitarian tradition. That's one of the sort of basic building blocks of that tradition, except that if you look at the classical utilitarians like Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they tend to talk a lot about pleasure and not so much about happiness. Mill does talk about happiness, but they tend to reduce it to pleasure. And I think that one of the reasons that that tradition has developed a rather bad reputation is that it's thought to be exclusively concerned with pleasure. But I think that human life is a lot richer than that. I think the idea of happiness is a lot richer than that. So that's why I prefer to talk about happiness on the one hand and unhappiness or suffering on the other hand. And that for me is what gets the whole enterprise going. Ethics has to have some kind, to my mind anyway, has to have some kind of foundation in some kind of values, and those are my values, positive and negative. And what I call welfarism in the book is just the idea that for ethics, nothing matters except welfare, individual well-being. Is that covers it?
And so I'll turn it over to Abdu. You can just affirm that this is a subjective approach.
Yes, that's right. You mentioned about subjective, objective, that's right. Yeah. Notions like happiness can be quite, especially in the hands of philosophers, quite tricky notions, because happiness can be given a kind of objective interpretation in which you're not truly happy unless you're living the right life, living the good life, living a virtuous life. But that's not the kind of happiness I'm referring to in the book. I take happiness to be a subjective notion. It's a matter of how you're feeling about your life, whether you're living your life according to your own values and whether you're satisfied with the way your life is going. So it is a subjective notion, not an objective notion. So yeah, thank you for that opportunity to clarify.
No problem. Abdu, how about yourself? Where do you ground right and wrong and morality, and how does that play in your worldview?
Sure. Can I give you another opportunity for clarification? I have a question for
Sure.
you. I just want to make sure, happiness, are you saying happiness is subjective in the sense that it's not a moral category, it's just a state of being or a state of perception?
That's right. It's a state of being.
Okay. Would you?
It's a state of you.
Okay. Yeah.
I hope.
Right. And that's, I guess I wanted to make sure of that because
Yeah.
I don't want to subject you to subjectivism on a different level than you already.
No, I'm an objectivist about ethics and a subjectivist about well-being.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess in that we're both moral realists in that
Yeah.
sense, is that we actually believe that moral values and duties actually exist,
That's right.
independent of human opinion. And how I ground that is this, is that if we are the pinnacle of what exists as far as cognitively, at least on this planet, then it seems to me without something transcendent above us, then all we are left with is human opinion. Whether it's collective opinion or individual opinion, in some way, that's all we're left with, which to me suggests that is subjectivism. So morality then loses its mooring. As Nietzsche would say, it's unchained from its sun, as it were, moving backwards, sideways, in all directions. So I think that's the one thing that I think the Christian faith, or just theism tries to actually ground morality in a transcendent being. And it seems to me that when you look at things like morality, like why should we care about the welfare of other human beings? Outside of a selfishness, like I hope they care for mine. Outside of something like that, which I think isn't quite the same thing as morality so much as it's just, let's prevent people from eating me. Michael Ruse, for example, would talk about sort of an evolutionary trick that was foisted upon you by your genes to get you to be a social cooperator. It's not really morality, it's just a survival characteristic, as opposed to something that we think of as moral. I think that's got to be grounded in something not only transcendent, but also personal. But transcendent because it has to be something that human opinion is subject to without necessarily being something that we mold over time, but it also has to be personal. It seems to me that moral categories or moral things they're strange categories. J.L. Mackie, Kai Nielsen, they would say some of these things too. There's the strange kind of things that would seem to be weird to exist outside a transcendent being. So for example, let's take goodness, or let's take justice. You can't say, well, there's justice over there. Look at that. It's wearing a hat today. No one does that, right? It's not a personal thing. And therefore, it actually imposes upon us no obligation. It also doesn't actually attach to justice. It doesn't actually attach to any causative power. So for example, you can't say justice is being just. You can't say it's being unjust. It's just inert. It's this thing. It's this blobby idea. So like the sort of a Platonist idea of it, it just exists and we conform our actions to its dictates. But and I would go back to saying, it doesn't actually dictate anything. Whereas persons are just. Persons are kind. Persons are compassionate. So it seems to me that objective morality, moral duties, and moral values, to be objective, have to be beyond or transcend human opinion, but rooted still in a person, in some kind of personhood. And that to me seems to be God, because he's transcendent and he's personal. And therefore, obligations flow from personhood, and I think morality flows from personhood. So that's how I think I would ground that, which goes back to, I think, responding to, in some senses, objections to Christianity, which are, or any theistic worldview where we say there's a God, he creates everything, but a lot of things are terrible, or there's undeserved suffering and these kind of things. I think one, that objection presupposes the objectivity of morality, but that presupposition of objective morality, I think, necessitates as its grounding a transcendent being. That transcendent being actually interacts with the world such that not only does, and I think one of the things you can show is that, look, if there is suffering in the world and it's undeserved suffering, and you can say, as a theist, all you have to do to defeat the logical problem of evil is say it's at least possible, at least offer one defeater that says it's at least possible that a transcendent, even all good being could allow it, not create it, but allow it for a greater good. Maybe the fact that there's freedom in the world leads to these things and there's something ultimately going to come of it. That defeats the logical problem. But there's still the probabilistic problem. Like, why so much of it? Why so egregious and all these things? And again, I think that we're not in a position to know that, except to say this from the Christian perspective. If it's at least feasible that a being who knows all things and is the ground of morality allows for certain things, suffering to happen in the world for a greater possible purpose that I don't know, then in the Christian faith, it's not just a logical defeater against the idea that God exists. In the Christian faith, it's a historical reality. Because if it's possible that God could allow suffering for a greater possible good, the Christian has history which says God actually allowed suffering on his own son, totally undeserved suffering, on his own son for the greatest possible good, which is the salvation of the world.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One thing Abdu said I completely agree with, and that is if we subtract a transcendent being from the picture, all we're left with is human opinion. I think that's right. Maybe I have a higher esteem for human opinion than Abdu does, because I think that's good enough. Opinion's rather a wishy-washy term, so I would like human belief, but maybe more strongly human reason, human rationality. I think that's how we get to morality. I agree. I'm as much an objectivist about ethics as Abdu is. I think that what's right isn't determined by what we believe is right. I think we can be mistaken about what's right. There are truths about morality that are independent of our beliefs about them. But as rational inquirers, we can go about trying to discover those truths just as much as we can go about trying to discover truths in science. I think morality, ethics, and science are different domains of human rational inquiry in which we are constantly trying to find our way toward the truth. We do well or badly by times, but we hope anyway the progression is toward the truth through the processes of critical thinking and rational inquiry. And I've never been able to understand what's added by presupposing a transcendent being, what role that being might play in that whole process. If the idea is that we learn what's right or wrong by listening to that being, however that might be possible, if we're told basically, then, I think we're back to the dilemma that Plato posed in the Euthyphro. If God says something is right, is it right because God says it, or does God say it because it's right? The idea that it's right because something can be right because somebody said it's right, it's exactly the idea we reject by saying that morality is objective. Nobody's opinion determines what's right. But if it's right independently, if God says if God says it's right because it's right independently, then it's right independently, and we don't need God. So I've never seen a satisfactory answer to that dilemma, and so I think that a transcendent being is just a fifth wheel. We can get along perfectly well without.
So maybe to press a little bit more, Professor Sumner. So in some people's view of happiness, it might be at the expense of others or even in the suffering of others. Mm-hmm. Some people probably have bosses that are like that. Like, do you feel like people's views of happiness somehow need to conform to some kind of ideal so that everybody can exist in a happy place at the same time, or how does that actually work out?
No, it's a nice idea, and sometimes I wish that I could go down that road, but it would be inconsistent with the way in which I subjectivize happiness. So there are no external standards here for what you should be happy in or happy about. So I'm not going to dictate to you what you should find enriching your life or what sorts of values or ideals you should be pursuing. I might disagree with some of them, but I'm not going to deny that they can make you happy. And so I'm condemned to believe that really nasty, evil people can be really happy. I wish they couldn't, but sadly, I think Donald Trump probably is pretty happy. And while I'd love to deny him that, I think I can't do that without starting to build values into happiness that go down, I think, a very dangerous road. You're not really being happy unless you're living up to some ideal.
So where does like the ethics come into this, where there's like kind of a superstructure that curbs happiness for some?
Well, happiness, I mean, to say that happiness is valuable or has intrinsic value is to say that everybody's does. Right? This isn't a philosophy of egoism where it's just each person is to pursue their own happiness. The idea behind saying that happiness is intrinsically valuable is that we have a reason to care about everybody's. And I think, again, that's where ethical responsibilities, ethical obligations begin. You therefore have obligations not to make people suffer. You have obligations to try to enhance or build or contribute to, or at least not block or impede their happiness. These obligations may be stronger towards some individuals than others. There may be room here for members of your family counting for more than distant strangers do, and so on. But the values remain the same. And so the limits to what I should do or what I'm entitled to do are going to be basically determined by what the impact of my actions will be on others and on their well-being, whether it's happiness on the one hand or suffering on the other. So ethics is an extremely intricate structure of ideas and concepts. Abdu mentioned justice. You can build a cathedral of intricate concepts within the domain of ethics. But I think at the bottom, it becomes quite simple. And the simple idea is don't hurt others, promote their well-being as best you can, do the same for yourself.
So Abdu, you would say from a Christian perspective, this valuing of others is also, and the flourishing of the individual is also a goal within your worldview as well.
Well, yeah, I think that it is, with the limits of course, and the understanding of some people's flourishing is, to put it in air quotes, I suppose, because Jeffrey Dahmer, I remember Jeffrey Dahmer had said that, he said, my flourishing is based on the suffering of others, and that's it. To quote another person who we might think of as aberrantly evil. I think that, for example, you have the Golden Rule, right? And this is interesting all by itself. You go to the United Nations, and one of the most popular, in fact, the most popular attraction at the United Nations is this mosaic on the wall, which is painted by Norman Rockwell. It's a mosaic based on his painting, where people of different faiths and different cultures are standing shoulder to shoulder in various poses of thought and cooperation. And it says right in there, inscribed in stone, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Those are the words of Jesus. What's interesting about that is that eventually that facade became cracked, which is poetic, all by itself. And they needed to restore it. And then they restored it. Jan Eliasson, the UN Deputy Secretary General, at the ceremony said, this idea of the Golden Rule is of the core of our charter at the UN. It represents the bridge between the world as it is and the way we want it to be. So that's interesting because the Golden Rule specifically says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's interesting to me that it doesn't say do unto others so that they'll do unto you, or do unto others so they don't do unto you. Do as they would do unto you, as you would have them do unto you. It's self-sacrificial, in other words. It's actually vulnerable. It doesn't do to get or to prevent. It does solely for the good of someone else. And that again, that goes based on the idea of what you are and what the Christian message actually teaches that you and I are, which goes back, I think, even further to the objective reality of morality and these obligations and duties. I don't think it's a fifth wheel. I don't think God is sort of the superfluous fifth wheel. I think the Euthyphro dilemma, which has been answered, for example, by Robert Adams in some of his work, has talked about this as a false dilemma in this sense. When Plato had Euthyphro give this dilemma, he was talking about it in terms of gods of the Greeks, which is fundamentally different than the Christian conception of God. The Greeks had their gods sort of emerge from something else. There was an ether, like the Babylonians thought, or the Greeks thought there was this ether from which they emerged. They were, in other words, contingent beings. The Christian conception of God is that God is a necessary being. He is not contingent upon anything. He is the ground of all being. And therefore, if good exists, it exists necessarily because he exists. And therefore, the objection sort of falls away, because it's not that God wills something because it's good external to himself. It's that God wills something because he is the good. As the necessary being, he is the good. And therefore, everything he wills is necessarily good because he is that good. And is something good because he wills it? The answer is yes, because again, it grounds itself. He is the paradigm of all that is good. And so the objection that the horns are meant to gore you on this one or gore you on that one. Well, if you split them by pointing out that neither one of these two things actually pertains, if you understand what a Christian means by God, what he means by that, or she means by that, is he is the ground of all being, and therefore he is the summum bonum. He is the good that Plato thought was one of the forms. In fact, you could even argue if he's not, then the Euthyphro dilemma proves too much, because you could say, well, is something good because the good wills it, or does the good will it because it's good? Well, you have to have a stopping point at some point. You keep regressing back and forth. What does goodness mean? What is goodness? You could say it's what human beings decide it is, or you can have a stopping point. Then the necessary being, which is God, seems to me to be a great stopping point, because he's personal and he's transcendent. And if you believe in transcendent morality that happens to affect persons, he's a natural stopping point to it. So to me, that makes him not a fifth wheel, but it also goes back to the question actually, as it stands, is happiness is important. But what the Christian actually looks for isn't happiness. What the Christian looks for is joy. Now, I'm not playing semantics there. I'm actually saying that there's something different to that. Happiness can exist momentarily and then be fleeting, and you try to sustain it over time. What the Christian message teaches me, for example, even in immense suffering, I know people who are involved in terrible suffering in their lives, terrible suffering. It's interesting to me, the problem of evil as an objection to God's existence is usually a Western thing. A lot of Easterners, and a lot of Easterners in this room, you know this, coming from your backgrounds, we're intensely religious people, despite the fact that most of the suffering in the world happens in Africa and in the East, economically and resource-wise. Now, someone could say, well, that's a crutch, which I think is a little demeaning to the people out there, that they're basically they're giving up their faculties as rational people in order to have a crutch to get them through a tough life. They don't ask this question about where is God in suffering, even though they're the ones who suffer the most. It's because they're not looking for happiness. They are looking for food, obviously. They're looking for an end to the injustices, obviously. But what they're looking for is joy. And what I think religion tries to do in general, but the Christian message tries to speak in specific, is not happiness. That's not the goal of life. The goal of life is to know God, who is the source of all being. And if you know that, then you can know joy despite all the circumstances of your life.
Do you want to respond to that, Professor Silver?
No. I mean, the idea that you can circumvent the Euthyphro dilemma by positing a necessary being or a being who's necessarily good, I don't think really does anything for it at all, because you still have to have an independent idea of what the good is in order to posit that God is good or God is the good. And so, the question still becomes, where does that come from? But I think this debate's going to get sterile pretty soon. On. So let's move on to something else.
So we're actually going to shift gears a little bit. One of the questions that we got was, what do you admire most in each other's positions? If you're to say, like, I can't buy it, but I really appreciate that aspect of the other person's position or worldview, or even something that you heard tonight. Do we have a volunteer to go first?
Yeah, I'll go, because, I had to think about this, right? I know I'm debating with the Christians, so I've got to think.
We're in dialogue, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, we're dialoguing with in coffee conversation with the Christian.
Without
and so, I've got to find something that I admire in the Christian worldview. So I'm going to shift the question just a little bit. I'm not sure whether admire is the right term, But there is something about it that I envy a lot and wish I had and don't have any access to and never will. And that's the degree of certainty that can come from faith, that can come from a particular body of truth that you hold as a matter of faith. That can be unshakable, it seems to me, and provide a kind of sort of secure center around which you can build everything else, because it can't be shaken. And I don't have that, and it's forever denied to me. It's denied to me because, well, as I said earlier, one of the reasons I'm an atheist is that I want my beliefs to track evidence, and you're never certain that your beliefs are adequately tracking evidence. You can never be absolutely sure whether you're responding to all of the evidence or the best evidence, so you're constantly in the position of needing to change your mind or rethink what you believe, especially in the light of new evidence, especially in the light of conflicting evidence, and so on. So you're never quite settled, because you're never quite there. Also, all of my training as a philosopher has reinforced the imperative that you question everything. You cannot take anything for granted. You have to keep your mind open about everything you believe, and be willing to think critically about it, and be willing to respond to other people's arguments and objections that are leveled against your beliefs. And because that process never comes to a conclusion, you can never be absolutely certain about anything. You can hold a body of beliefs, certainly, because not to do that is not to be human. You have to have at any given time a body of beliefs. But you also know that there's no part of that body of belief that's immune to revision in the light of evidence or the light of critical inquiry. And that can be daunting. I remember teaching undergraduate courses, especially in ethics, but it didn't matter, any philosophical field. And students would come up to me afterwards and say, "I'm confused about this." And I would say to them, "That's good, you should be." Or they would say, "I came into this course thinking that I knew what I believed, but now I have no idea." And I would say, "That's good, you've been listening." Uncertainty is a good frame of mind. It's a good state to be in. Doubt is a good state to be in. Self-criticism is a good state to be in. But it has its costs. And sometimes I wish I could find a secure spot to rest on that I thought was unshakable. And I don't have that. And I think that Christians and other adherents to faith-based belief systems can have it. And sometimes I envy them for that.
How about yourself, Abdu?
Yes, I think it's an excellent question. Sort of a left-handed compliment there you gave us, in that I wish I could be sort of a blind follower of something. I think that's sort of the import there. But it's interesting because certitude is not something that a Christian feels in the strict philosophical sense of, boy, I have absolute certainty and I will never listen to anything anybody else has to say about this. I can tell you from my own story, I wasn't a Christian before. And I was a theist. I believed in God. But when my faith was shaken, it was interesting. The Bible was the thing that actually got me there. In Luke chapter 3, verse 7 and following, John the Baptist makes this interesting statement. People come to him to be baptized, and he says, "Who told you to flee from the wrath to come?" Meaning God's judgment. And then he said something really fascinating to me. He said, "Do not think to yourself. Do not even begin to think to yourself. You have Abraham as your father. For I tell you, God can raise up children from Abraham from the stones." What he's saying there in a theistic context, he's basically saying, tradition won't save you. Don't just make assumptions about what's right and what's wrong and all these things. He basically challenged me. I remember reading this book, not wanting to believe a word of it, and challenged suddenly to say, are you being objective? Are you swallowing everything in your favor and everything against the other side, the other side as well? So I did have this sort of journey of this sort, and atheism was on the table, Buddhism, other pantheistic worldviews were on the table. Christianity and Islam were the ones that sort of rose to the top in this long search. And there's a lot of reasons why I could say why I'm a Christian. And someone said, why are you a Christian? It's not, I found it nice or comforting, although that's part of it, and there's nothing illegitimate with that. Because need is a good warrant. Fulfillment of need is a good warrant for believing something, at least to a degree. But I think there's plenty of actual evidence in favor of the Christian worldview. But what I admire quite a bit about Dr. Sumner's position, Professor Sumner, we don't want to be pretentious, is first, I think the realization of the value of human beings and the idea that there is moral realism, but more than the philosophical, I think there's a bit of a touch in your philosophy. It can seem dry and sort of patently like academic, but though I might disagree on your views on euthanasia or abortion, I don't think you believe those things based on what I've heard today and other places out of a simple, I'm pro-choice, and that's all there is to it. There's a compassion. There's a compassion for those who are suffering. There's a compassion that's there, and I admire that quite a bit about you.
Great. So, that was really, really profound.
Become a mutual admiration society up here.
So, the question that started this whole night off that we actually haven't touched on yet, and we'll wrap up with these last two questions, is why am I here? If you were to answer that question succinctly, and then we'll move on to Q&A, so you'll get some more time to engage with the audience. How would you respond to that? Who would like to take that one first?
He volunteered the last time. If you want to go,
Go for
free.
it. Go for it.
It's, in some ways we've already answered it. I think on both of our ends we've already answered it. So really it's a summarization, I think in some degree. There's this idea of why am I here? And I think there's two parts to this. There's an objective and a subjective nature to it. I think that Professor Sumner will actually appreciate my desire to subjectivize certain things, but also make it objective as well. I think there's an objective purpose for why we were created. And this goes back to the claim that we are made in God's image. And we are made in God's image. And that doesn't mean simply we're rational. That's part of it. But we're also relational. We are inherently, incurably relational. And I don't think we're relational in a hive mentality. We're not relational like bees collect and ants form colonies. I don't think we're relational in the sense that buffalo form in herds to prevent the weaker ones from getting picked off by whatever hunters or cougars or whatever it is that hunt buffalo, whatever those animals are. I don't think we're relational that way. That's instinctual. Each one of us, everybody in this room, has, wants, covets, or mourns the loss of relationships. We are incurably relational beings. And it isn't a matter of survival. It's not just we do this for survival. I think that sterilizes things to the point where it's actually no longer a real relationship. It's just Pitocin in your mind or whatever that hormone is that creates infatuation, whatever, that kind of thing. I think we're more than that. I think we all would agree to some degree, at least maybe you don't, we're more than chemical machines or just sophisticated chips. We're more than that. We're incurably relational. We reflect something. If our cause is blind, pitiless, and indifferent, as Dawkins might say, a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe that neither knows nor cares, where there is no such thing as good and evil, then why do we recognize good and evil, and why do we want relationships so badly? Maybe it's not because a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe created us. Maybe it's because we reflect something of the divine, and not just any divine, but the Christian conception of the divine. The Christian believes that there is one God in three persons, one substance with three personhood or three centers of consciousness, Father-loving Son, Son-loving Spirit, Spirit-loving Father, and on it goes in eternity in the community of the Trinity. So God himself is the locus and is the definition of relationship. He is the cause, you are the effect. You reflect something of the cause, which goes back to the why we're here thing. And people always ask this question, why am I here? And we see it in the media all the time, sort of comically speaking, where Forrest Gump runs across the United States 3 times and grows a beard super long, and people think he has the answers because for some reason, running long distances make you profound. Or you gotta climb some mountain somewhere, and when you get to the top, there's this sort of ashram and a guy sitting in the lotus position with eyebrows that won't quit, and you ask him the question, why am I here? Oh, great guru, or whatever it is. And as he opens his mouth, and the media cuts the commercial because this why am I here question is so hard to answer. I think the answer goes back to this idea of relationship. You and I were created objectively to have relationship vertically with the source of all good, with the source of all love, which is why the Bible says God is love. Not God is loving, but God is love because he exists in this eternal community. But then there's the subjective. The question is now, why are you here? I think when your objective purpose for relationship with the divine and your relationship with others that reflects a self-sacrificial relationship coalesce into the passions with which you've been endowed, into the gifts with which you've been endowed, whether it's mathematics or philosophy or science or homemaking or fathering or mothering, whatever it might be, when those 2 things coalesce, that's when I think you find your actual objective and subjective purposes coalescing together.
Great. How about you, Dr. Sumner?
I was mentioning earlier some of the reasons why I'm an atheist. I'm going to add another one now. One of the ideas I find most objectionable in some religions, including Christianity, is the idea that I'm here for somebody else's purpose, that I was made to satisfy or play a role in somebody else's plan. I find that idea demeaning. I find that idea an assault on my dignity as an individual who's capable of finding my own purposes for my own life. And the idea that I'm a pawn in somebody else's chess game, however grand and cosmic it might be, I find objectionable. So the questions, why am I here? We can ask that on an individual basis. Why am I as a particular individual here? Or why are you as a particular individual here? And I think the answer there largely is luck. In fact, have you ever reflected on how incredibly improbable you are? How improbable it is that the world produced you as opposed to somebody else? I mean, even think about it on a very recent scale, right? Why are you here? Well, the immediate answer is, well, because your parents met and decided they liked one another and decided to have children. First of all, that's improbable that they would ever have done that. But secondly, once they decided to do that, you are the product of a unique fusion between an egg and a sperm, right? Your mother produced several thousand eggs during her lifetime, and your father produced several billion spermatozoa, and you are the result of the fusion of one of those sperm cells and one of those eggs. The odds against you existing are astronomical. And then you can push this back through generations. The odds against your parents existing were also astronomical, and so on all the way back. If you ask the question, why are we here collectively? Why is there such a thing as human life on this planet? Then that question has an answer. And again, it's an answer you discover by going as far back as you can. So think about the idea of common ancestors. If you have siblings, then you and your siblings have common ancestors, namely your parents. If you have cousins, then all of your cousins have common ancestors, namely your grandparents. And the wider you spread the field, the range, the scope, the more common ancestors you have if you trace it back. If you think about it on a species level, all human beings, every one of us, every human that's ever existed has a common ancestor. We're all cousins. Many, many millions of times removed, but we're all cousins. And the same holds for all mammals, all primates, all mammals, all vertebrates. All living things have a common ancestor. Does anyone know what LUCA is? L-U-C-A? LUCA is a bacterium, a single-celled bacterium that existed somewhere near a gas vent under the ocean more than 4 billion years ago. And he's your ancestor, and mine, and the ancestor of every living thing on this planet. LUCA stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. The last organism that is the ancestor of every living thing, plant and animal, on the earth. And so the answer to the question, why do we exist, is LUCA. We exist because LUCA existed. Because the planet had the chemical properties that were conducive to life. It's located in the Goldilocks zone, it has ample water. Life forms formed and then evolved. That process of evolution brought us the species, brought us collectively, and through that process of a series of incredibly astronomically improbable events, it resulted in you. It could easily have been somebody else, but it turned out to be you. So just, you won the lottery. No, feel lucky, you got here.
Great. Well, I think actually we'll tie up this coffee hour, and we can move on to some audience Q&A. So just a reminder that you can text in your questions to the number on the board, and I've already got a few texted questions that can start us off tonight. And I'd just like to thank you guys. That was a really fascinating conversation. I hope it was fascinating for you guys as well. But just thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so this one's for Dr. Sumner. So you said that humans are sufficient to determine morality apart from a higher being, but also said that there are truths that are beyond our rationality. Don't those things contradict?
I hope I didn't say that there were truths that are beyond our rationality, meaning by that truths that are beyond our ability to rationally discover, because I don't believe that. I did say that we discover truth through rational processes and that we are constantly striving to discover it, and it's always possible that we're mistaken. That's basically what, I mean, Abdu and I agree on the objectivity of ethics, and that's basically what that means, that our ethical beliefs can be mistaken, however devoutly or seriously we hold them. So, you know, what I said before, I guess I'll just reaffirm that ethics is a rational discipline, just as science is a rational discipline, and we discover truths in it through the same processes that we discover truths about nature, namely by the use of evidence and reasoning. And it's always imperfect because we can never be absolutely certain we've got there. I think that we can be more certain about some things than others. It would take a lot to shake my certainty that suffering is bad and that happiness or well-being is good, that the latter is to be promoted and the former is to be prevented and so on. But those are very simple ethical truths. Ethics gets very complicated. I'll give you an example. These days, I mentioned before that I've been much involved in discussions about physician-assisted dying, and which is now legal in this country. So the issue, just as when abortion was legalized in 1988 in this country through the Morgentaler decision, the issue shifted from the question of whether abortion was legal or not, whether it was legally available to women, to questions of access. How accessible is it? How easily or otherwise are women able to access the service? Likewise, the same thing has happened with physician-assisted dying in Canada. It's legal, so patients who qualify for it have a legal right to it. That doesn't mean they have effective access to it. And so there are all kinds of access issues and all kinds of obstacles to access. One of them is the refusal by faith-based healthcare institutions in this country to provide this service. So there are over 100 Catholic hospitals, long-term care facilities, hospices, and so on in Canada, all of whom refuse to provide the service on grounds of a moral or religious objection to it. They're all publicly funded. So one of the questions I've been wrestling with recently is, do they have a right to refuse this? Right? On the one hand, they take public funds and they provide healthcare services, and this is a healthcare service to which individuals have a legal right and need access. On the other hand, we do have freedom of religion enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country. And so the question becomes whether or not institutions can avail themselves of that constitutional right to freedom of religion. I mention this just as it's an ethical question. Do they have a moral right to refuse to provide this service or not? But it's a very difficult ethical question. The only way to try to find the right answer or the best answer to it is to go to work on it and think your way through it and try to figure out what the issues are and come up with a solution. That's the way I think ethics works.
All right. Another question is for you, Abdu. Professor Sumner raised the objection of the child suffering from a disease. So how do you respond to this idea of the child with cancer dying and suffering horribly in view of omnipotent, all-good creator?
Yeah. Well, this is one of these hard to answer in a soundbite kind of answers, but in a sense, I sort of alluded to some of the responses to this, is that one, the question is, there's two forms of this problem of evil. There's a probabilistic problem, and then there's a logical problem. And I think that you can, in a cold sort of like let me just tell you, here's the logical way to get out of the issue. It sort of sounds escapist, doesn't it? That you just get out of it by saying that a God who knows all things and who is all good could possibly think that these things could exist in a world of free creatures, and it's possibly not even feasible to create a world of free creatures where these kinds of things don't result, whether it's natural disaster or it's cancer or it's someone murdered someone. It's perfectly possible or perfectly logical to think that it's not feasible for such a being to create a world of free creatures where you can't have these kind of results. Second, though, I would say this is that, again, it does presuppose the objective reality or the objectivity of the wrongness of the suffering. And I still think that's incoherent without a transcendent being in whom the morality is grounded. So I think the question actually, if you presuppose evil, you presuppose good. If you presuppose good and evil, you presuppose a moral law by which there's differentiated. And you have to have some kind of level of, yes, rationality helps us to differentiate them, but in order to understand the bent lines, you got to know what a straight line actually is. And I think that that's rooted in God. So the objection itself has to find itself rooted in a transcendent being as well, based on the idea of what morality actually is. The response, though, to this, I think becomes, one, it can become philosophical. Two, it can become theological, where, again, there's this idea that if God knows all these things and he creates a world where freedom is better than non-freedom, where reactions to things that happen in the world, and there's actually consequences to our actions. So let's say, for example, way back, there are people who act in a certain way, using their God-given freedom to act in a way that's contrary to the physical health of human beings, and cancer develops over time, or other things develop over time as a consequence of that. There are consequences to our bad actions, and they could happen generations and generations and generations ago, who knows how long ago, to result in something that causes children to die at an early age. So I think that these are certainly within the realms of possibility. But then it goes back to, there's the philosophical, there's possibly the historical, but I think it goes back to the pastoral part of this, or the idea of why does this question matter? It matters, and it's important for all of us, because one, we don't like to see the suffering of children. I don't think God delights in this either. I don't think it's like he's like, oh, well, that kid died, I don't care, or whatever it might be. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's that God does care about these things. The Bible specifically says in multiple places where God does care about these things, specifically God, for example, Jesus himself raises people from the dead, he heals the sick, and all these things. And he's called upon us to use our God-given abilities to try to cure these things, and I think help things out in this way as well. I think there could be a greater possible plan. A friend of mine asked me this very same question. Himself an agnostic. We were in school together, and he was an agnostic. Really, he was an atheist, but he left the room. He's like, there could be a God, but I haven't seen enough. And that's fine. And plenty of atheists actually take that perspective as well. He said, we were sitting over coffee. Actually, we were sitting over a meal that became coffee because we were talking for so long that the waitstaff was like, when are you leaving? And he asked me this question. He said, how can you tell me this God is good and values me or my mother if you let her die of cancer when I was 10? It's basically the same question. But it's got the philosophical rubber has met the existential road. This question now matters personally. It's not just a matter of academic discussion or philosophical discussion. And so you go through all these various issues and you talk about these things, whether it's philosophical or whatever it might be, then you talk to me, you look at him in the eye, and you see that level of hurt, that level of pain. And the first thing I tried to do was say, look, I don't know what it's like to lose someone that close to me at such a tender age. I've lost people close to me. I definitely have. I'm no stranger to suffering myself. But I would say this, that one, you've asked two questions. How can I know God is good and God values me or my mother? I think part of that is if God stayed aloof from it all and just let it happen and didn't do anything about it, I think the indictment might be a little stronger. But in Christianity, he actually does do something about it. He himself, one of the persons of the Trinity, actually incarnates, who bears no burdens of his own and is sinless, volunteers to pay a debt that you and I owe. And in that, there will be a time, as the Bible says, where there'll be no more death. He will wipe away every single tear from their eye. What that actually says is that the connotation is he doesn't just like go like this, a magic wand, and everyone stops crying. He literally walks up to you and puts his hand on your cheek and wipes it away individually. So God could allow suffering for a greater possible good that works out in some way. Am I going to say I know that? I don't. But I know that he did in history. That's one. But two, I think pain is also in some senses, I'm not saying it for utilitarian purposes. I'm not saying that God allows a child to suffer so that you know how valuable the child was for you. I'm just saying that there's an added phenomenon to it, that pain is the signal of value. And I've lost people very close to me, or I've experienced things like this, where someone has, I've walked with people who've gone through unspeakable pain. One of my closest friends recently passed away from stomach cancer at 34 years old. One of the brightest minds I've ever met, and an amazing articulator of why he's a Christian, having come from a non-Christian background. And you ask yourself these questions, and what's interesting to me is that pain, when I saw the look of pain on his parents' face as he was going through this, and then eventually when they lost him, I realized something. It's not just simply the ceasing of the function of an organism. It's actually the death of a person. And I think that personhood makes sense, and I think makes the best sense if God exists and if you are endowed and created in his image, as opposed to a blob of chemicals that has the epiphenomenon of consciousness. I think that makes more sense. So when you grieve the death of a child, it's not just simply an organism I'm biologically attached to has ceased functioning. It's a lot more than that. Pain is the signal of value. And if you lose someone and there's that pain, I think that there's something to that. Recognizing the value of another person. Does that answer the question fully? The answer is, I think it partially does, but I'm not going to be able to pretend that I know why a certain child would die. All I know is that in Christianity, in addition to the other evidences, both historical and theological and philosophical, I think we have historical evidence that Jesus didn't just simply say, suffering is real, get over it. He did something about it.
Great. So this one's kind of for both of you guys. So both of you kind of have alluded to this idea that somehow if we can just like take our time and think through everything, we can get to this objective truth or reality. This person asked the question, do you think our own biases influence how we see the world and how we even rationalize things? And for you, Dr. Sumner, is there some implications of a God that stop you from believing in such or seeing the evidence for? And same with you, Abdu, are you holding on to something that religion gives you that certitude that you can't let go of in order to kind of embrace Professor Sumner's worldview? Mm-hmm. So why don't we give that to Professor Sumner to start off with?
Okay. I was mentioning before how I envy those who, I won't lay this on Abdu anymore, envy those who can feel comfortably certain in their beliefs. And I can't myself. And one of the more recent reasons for my not being able to find refuge in that kind of certainty was reading the work of Daniel Kahneman. How many of you read Kahneman? One person, okay. Kahneman and his former colleague Amos Tversky have spent most of their professional lives unearthing the various heuristics and cognitive biases that we all use in navigating around the world and exposing the irrationality of many of these things. And so if you take that fully on board, you have to believe that your own navigation around the world, your own set of beliefs, is likely partly the basis of these biases too. To do anything else would be to lack humility. How can you be the only one who has unbiased beliefs and everybody else is making these terrible blunders? So yeah, if I'm asked, look, you've got a set of beliefs here. Some of them are moral beliefs. Some of them are factual beliefs about whether or not there is a God. Is it possible that these beliefs are influenced by your own biases, by your own upbringing, by various unconscious influences on your thinking? I've got to say, yeah, it's entirely possible. I'll do my best to try to identify them, find them, root them out if I can find them, but I can't say for certain they're not there. I will say one small thing in defense of my current atheism. I wasn't always an atheist. I was once a theist. So it can't be said that I've been biased forever against belief in a deity. I haven't been. I was once there. I am an apostate from that belief system. I came to think that it lacked a satisfactory rational foundation. I came to think, as I said before, my belief in it wasn't evidence-based. But I began with a bias in favor of it. I grew up a Christian, grew up in a Christian church, and only later drifted away from that. Now, of course, it's possible I drifted away from it because of my biases, but at least I didn't begin with a bias against the Christian worldview or belief in a Christian God. I tried it out and discovered or came to realize that it just wasn't for me. I couldn't stay there. Abdu was once a Muslim, is now a Christian, so we're both capable of changing our minds about some pretty fundamental things. But I take the idea of bias seriously. I take the idea of not just cognitive biases, but hidden biases very seriously. As a teacher, I've had to try to examine and deal with my own biases in the classroom. It's easy, for instance, to judge people by their appearance and to draw conclusions about, what they're thinking or what they might think, or how worthwhile the things that they say might be, and so on. You have to try to remove all of those biases. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the experiments that have been done where identical essays are given to teachers with a male name on one and a female name on the other, and the guys always get the higher grades. These kinds of hidden biases are there. They're biases based on gender, biases based on race. I think it's crucially important for us to be self-examining, to try to identify those biases. But if you suggest that maybe we could be completely bias-free, I think that's probably impossible. I think that's, as humans, we're just never going to quite get there.
Abdu?
Well, I'll be brief because I largely agree with everything Professor Sumner has said. It's an important thing to understand this. Confirmation bias is not just like those people do it. When you look at the studies and they show how often it is that people actually engage in confirmation bias, where you and I can look at the same exact evidence and come to completely different conclusions based on our predisposed views on what the evidence should show, it's quite alarming. And I think oftentimes, students do this. I remember doing this myself in cognitive psychology classes. When you learn this information, you're like, yeah, but not me. Well, if it's 77% of the people would do a certain thing, well, then chances are, yeah, you. Those statistics don't exist in a vacuum. They didn't create, we got a bunch of bad people to go do this stuff. It's human beings who do it. I think, yeah, we have to worry about this level of bias. I think that there are certain beliefs that we can actually have that, I'm not saying you were saying this, but there's certain things that have become either properly basic or so evidentially true, or at least seemingly self-evident, that it takes a lot to shake you from it. And that doesn't mean you're biased. It just means that you have strong reasons for your view. For example, the view that I'm sitting. The view that you know how much evidence it would take for you to give me to tell me that I'm not sitting? And it's not my bias, it's just my very strong evidence that I'm sitting down right now. It's a properly basic belief almost for this. So you have to have a lot of evidence to disprove it for me. But we have to come at this thing with the understanding that there is bias. And people believe their worldviews, not just because we're not, I put it this way, we're not all Mr. Spock, where we're just logic machines. And we're not just big crying babies who just want what we want. Give me food, give me whatever. We're not that, none of us are. We all have to understand we are logical beings, but we're also very need-based beings. And sometimes a worldview can actually feed a need. The question isn't, does the feeding of the need delegitimize the worldview? It was Freud who said that, Christianity is invented by people who have, daddy issues, which is why they invent their sky daddy. One could easily respond back to Freud and say, well, the reason why you created psychoanalysis and you reject the sky daddy is because of your daddy issues. So you reject him because of your daddy issues. See, the point is that you can, this is something that happens to the best and brightest of us. I think we have to minimize that. I think it's very important. For me, I think it's important that, one, I think I do have a properly basic belief that doesn't mean you can't be shaken by some level of evidence, but the evidence has to be really, really high to disabuse me of the idea that I actually have an experience of God that I don't think is just simply, what I ate or wishful thinking, especially given the length to which I didn't want to believe in the Christian conception of God. Now, I didn't come from a theistic worldview to an atheistic one, or an atheistic one to a theistic one, but let me suggest this. The journey was no less revolutionary for me. No less revolutionary. In the East, and a lot of you from the East know this, it's an honor-shame-based culture. Religion is not, and cultural affiliation is not just a happenstance of your culture. When you're a Middle Easterner, what you are as a religion is who you are, even if you don't practice it. I know plenty of people who are Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever it might be, who will defend their worldview in a verbal death match with you, but don't practice one bit of it. And why is that? It's because it's not about what you adhere to, it's about who you are. It's an identity thing. That's a cultural thing. Now think about what it takes then to change And in the West, we don't think of it that way. Sam Solomon put it this way. If you draw a box and you put a square, a dot in the middle of it, in the West, the dot is religious expression for most of us, and the square is us. We sort of transcend all these things, our individuality. In the East, it's exactly the opposite. In the East, the community, what the community thinks of you, especially religious community, is the box. You're a small dot inside of it. So to invert that is to invert everything about you. Now, it doesn't mean that because you came from a different worldview that therefore the worldview you arrived to is true. It doesn't mean that at all. What it does mean is that whatever happened to you has to be taken seriously to some level. It could have been just wishful thinking, or it could have been something that was more evidence-based. I didn't become a Christian because I liked the idea of Jesus on the cross. I actually hated the idea of Jesus on the cross. And I wasn't about to lose all of that square that surrounded me, simply because, well, it's a nice idea.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I think we're going to end there, but I just wanted to say my appreciation. I think both of you have modeled, both in your lives and in the presentation tonight, just a spirit of open inquiry, the openness to change your mind, an openness to seek truth and to seek a truth that matters for people and leads to their flourishing. And so I think it's, on our part, it's part of a challenge to us, to also kind of endeavor to do those same things. And I just appreciate that you guys were able to model that this evening. And I'd just like to thank you for the time you took.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.